Good evening, everyone, and a very, very warm welcome to the Frontline Club. My name is Vin Ray. This session is one of a series that we've been doing between the club and the College of Journalism at the BBC, in which prominent journalists look back at seminal moments in their careers, and we look at their influences, and in doing so, I hope give us some insights into the craft and practice of journalism, possibly the future of journalism as well. The way it works, we're going to look through a few clips that we've selected and have a bit of discussion, but there'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. It's a kind of, for those who've been before, it's a sort of conflation of This Is Your Life and Desert Island Discs in the safe confines of the Frontline Club.
Live online.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Well, our guest this evening is one of the UK's most experienced journalists and is held in very, very high regard by his peers. His early years are well documented. He left school with one... Quickly interrupted by Idi Amin. Idi Amin. That's never happened to me before. His early years are well documented. He left school with one A-level. He picked up a couple more A-levels at Technical College in Scarborough, I think it was. Went on to study law at Liverpool University, but unfortunately was suspended from the university.
Fortunately.
Rusticated, I believe was the phrase. Somewhere along the way he was arrested for assaulting a policeman, but perhaps we'll come to that later, I don't know. And then he went off to run a centre for young drug addicts called the New Horizon Youth Centre. He never went back to university and thus disgracefully does not have a degree. But he did get into LBC and then to ITN where he became the Washington correspondent and then diplomatic editor until 1989 when he took on the job I think you do now, which is the presenter of Channel 4 News. Along the way he turned down an OBE, but he did accept quite a lot of awards, both as a presenter and a reporter. He is, of course, and please welcome, Jon Snow. Now, before we start tonight, I want to, a few years ago I was writing something and I asked Jon to make a contribution to it. And the question I asked him was, what makes a good broadcast journalist? Okay, and I'm going to read you what Jon wrote. What makes a good broadcast journalist? The capacity to keep your ego under control, to wake up in the morning with ideas burning holes in your brains, to get angry, laugh, cry in the morning, cry at the news of at least something first thing in the morning, to be inquisitive, nosy and politically motivated. All the best hacks in history have been motivated by the desire to see change. There is no such thing as a neutral journalist. We are all shaped by who we are, but we should recognise who we are and counter it with a desire to reflect other views of events beyond our own. But we should never ever desert what we believe in and what drives us. If you meet a flaccid broadcast journalist, shoot him or her. So I thought I'd better read that in case anyone's feeling flaccid. You better watch out, because Snowy will get you. We mentioned the Centre for Drug Addicts, Jon. On the 8th of June 1973, when you were still working at the Youth Centre, an article appeared in The Guardian under the headline, Christine is Dead. And it was Jon Snow's...
You've done some research.
Jon Snow's journalistic debut.
Yeah, well done.
What was it, Jon? What was that about?
It was actually about a homeless young woman who had big personality problems and quite a lot of mental illness. She was very young, I don't remember exactly how old, maybe 16 or 17, Christine. And she'd been a very regular attender at the centre, but we were never able to house her. It was even then, no easier these days, but it was very difficult to house her. But we were very fond of her, and she was very fond of us. And she died alone in a squat, I think of hypothermia, I don't remember exactly. But it seemed to me that her death spoke to a kind of tremendous gap in the welfare state, which still exists to this day. I mean, there's still there won't be any housing benefit for anybody, but there is no housing benefit for people between the ages of 16 and 18 she had been in care. Care in those days ended abruptly at 16, and after that there was nothing. And that's what I wrote about.
Did that experience of seeing your byline in The Guardian, did that make you think about being a journalist then?
I think it was actually Charles Wheeler who said that in the end, we broadcast journalists always look up to the print journalists because there is something about print which is, just appearing there and solidly in it. And I mean, there was a time when I was doing a diary in the FT, and I thought that was more or less the summit of achievement. I thought, gosh, to be in the Pink and, writing bits in that second section at the weekend. But, and in fact, I've just road tested one of Boris's bikes. I'm going to be in this weekend. I count it as a great thing to be in the Pink and. But I'm obviously completely outdated. But I think there is something in broadcast journalism. It seems to be gone as soon as you've done it. I know we can go and retrieve it off the net and the rest of it, but the chip paper business is true. It lies around the house. It's there, tangible, readable again. Whereas even downloading it on the the iPhone or the iPod or whatever it is just something different. You don't do it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Yes, it gave me a lot of pleasure to see that. Yeah.
So the same year you joined LBC. How did that happen, John? When you had no experience as a journalist at all?
I had none at all.
Why did they take you on?
The nepotism mainly. My cousin Peter Snow was at ITN, and the people who ran LBC were old ITN hands. And funny enough, they were not looking for a journalist. They were looking for somebody who could counsel people who were too mad to put on the first ever all-night phone-in. But what they, of course, didn't realise at the time was that you had to be mad to go on the all-night phone-in, and if you excluded the people who were mad, you couldn't put anybody on the air. So I had very little to do at a very early stage. And the thing was that they also realised, because nobody from the BBC had applied to work there, because they all thought it was going to fail, the only broadcasts they had were people who'd been on commercial radio in Canada and Australia. So they had very few English accents. And they said, listen, at least if you read a bit of news, it would look as if we've got some English people here.
So you ended up as a presenter?
I was a newsreader on day one at 6 a.m, having to fire my own carts, cartridges and the rest of it. It was absolutely amazing. No, I knew nothing. And then they went bankrupt. And a very brilliant guy called Marshall Stewart, who was the editor of the Today programme, was recruited as the editor, and he said, you can go on reading news until you die. You better get out in the field now and go and do some proper reporting. So I did.
It's easy to forget how big LBC were at the time. In your book, when you mentioned the foreign editor sent you somewhere, you couldn't conceive of them having a foreign editor anymore.
No, good God, they had 110 journalists. It's absolutely unbelievable. It was an absolutely massive operation. Of course, went bankrupt because they had 110 journalists. So it was a completely ludicrous setup. But it had wonderful ambitions. And in the first year, because there was no 24-hour television, there was no CNN, nothing like that, never been any 24-hour news radio of any sort, it was suddenly a tremendous asset. And a lot of people did listen to it in the beginning, beyond the taxi driving fraternity that still do. As a result, you got noticed. And that's how I got into television, because they said, do you want a job?
Do you like radio?
I think it's the ultimate medium, to be honest. And of course, it's making a very storming comeback. Yeah. I mean, I do. I think the pictures are better on radio.
Yeah, I understand. Do you want to explain what that means?
Well, I mean, I did in fact want to bring a piece, but I don't think we could find it. But I had to report the end of the Balcombe Street siege. I mean, we were made by the IRA bombing campaign across London in 1974. And I was made because I was on a bicycle. Because the thing was, what happened, as soon as a bomb went off, the plume of smoke would go up over the Old Bailey or wherever, and you'd head your bike straight for it. Traffic would back up immediately. You'd see the man from the Daily Express in the back of the cab. You'd overtake, you'd go straight through. The tapes would already be across the roads when you got there. You could zip underneath. They were so busy trying to fix everything else that they didn't stop. You'd get to the seat of the thing. You'd have a huge clunky Motorola walkie-talkie. No mobile phones, nothing like that. But you had and if you could keep your fingers depressed on the enormous switch on the side for long enough, you could actually speak via some aerial on LWT, and you could give an account of what was going on. And of course, the policeman would come up to you and say, "Can't stand there, mate." And say, "I'm afraid we're live on radio. Right? Would you like to contribute to our conversation here?" listeners, I've got PC 12349. Oh, fuck off, you know. And so you endlessly scooped everybody else because you were on a bike and you had a Motorola. As long as you didn't drop the Motorola, the trouble with the Balcombe Street siege, was what I wanted to play to, was that it was so cold as the Matthews came out on. This was a family that were held hostage by the RA for a very long time, several weeks. And the trouble was it was too cold to keep your hand on the switch for very long. And a very nice floor manager for ITN called Pat Harris agreed to keep her fingers on the switch while I spoke, and warm my hand in my pocket, and then when hers froze, I got mine across the thing. But you couldn't let the signal go, because if you let it go, you'd never get it back. But it was wonderful, and in fact, this Motorola picked up the atmospherics. You could hear the police sirens going across the square as the thing came to an end, the gasps of the people standing by as the family came out onto the balcony, the balaclavaed characters coming down the stairs, the police arresting. As I say, the pictures were utterly gripping. You could describe what was going on. Actually, live broadcasting is ultimately the most wonderful thing. It's the most liberating thing. Nobody can do anything. Nobody can intervene. You can make it up as it goes. You know, it just goes just like that. You know, I don't mean make it up, but you can conjure it up.
Fantastic. There's normally some students here or people thinking about a career in journalism. That was your beginning. I saw you quoted recently, I hope correctly, saying it's never been a more exciting time to be or become a journalist. Why do you think that?
Well, because I think the playing field has levelled. I mean, the nepotism has sort of dwindled, the drunkenness is gone. The fact, you know, I mean, the thing was a madcap operation in the beginning. You've been in it long enough to know. You know, I mean, News at 10 at ITV, which I joined in 1976, was awash with alcohol. I mean, absolutely unbelievable. Incredibly antisocial hours. And they would do a lunchtime bulletin, which meant then everybody went to the bar, which was in the building, inside the news area. I mean, incredible. There was a bar. And, you know, you'd see Reggie there, Reggie Bosanquet, who was the original drunk anchorman. And people watched not because they were interested in what he was going to say, but to see whether he would fall over. And he never actually did. Only Peter Woods ever fell over. He was for the BBC. But the incredible thing was that everybody drank after every show, so that by 6 o'clock, people were really getting on. And by 10 o'clock, I mean, they were absolutely awash. And newscasters would have several flagons of whiskey and the rest of it. I don't know, maybe they couldn't go on air without being drunk. And of course now to have purged that is sublime. I mean, it's fantastic.
But you're not telling people that it's better now to be a journalist because they can't drink anymore.
Well, it's one facet, because of course the editors were drunk as well. Yeah. I mean, you couldn't get any sense out of anybody. If you didn't drink, you weren't really, literally, in the swim. I remember a celebrated moment at the Wolsey Wine Bar, which was right across from ITN in Wells Street. I remember my editor of the day and another very celebrated character who ran the lunchtime news bulletin invited me for a drink at the Wolsey's Wine Bar. And this was a great honour. I thought it was tremendous. It was 6 o'clock, and I was on News at 10. I was going to have to report for News at 10. And we went in there, and I'm not the most tremendous drinker, to be absolutely honest, but anyway, we sat down, and within about an hour, I realised there were 6 spent bottles of wine on the table. And I wanted to pee. So I went downstairs to the gents, and of course I was a little bit unstable. And I fell against the cistern, which fell off the wall into the throne, and the water spurted out into the room. And the place was very quickly 6 inches deep and rising. And I fled up the stairs, made my excuses, and went back into the newsroom, peered down from the window up above, wondering at what point my editor and this celebrated man from the lunchtime news would actually drown. There was water everywhere, absolutely everywhere. I clearly detonated a main of some sort. But that was completely standard practice. But the genuine thing now is that I really do think that with the blogosphere, with radio, with all the platforms that are available, it is possible for people to make a name for themselves and, in fact, to prevail. There are 1 or 2 people in this room I know who are prevailing as a result of the kind of relatively egalitarian opportunity that now exists in the media. I mean, you're never going to have a job for life like I have had. That's true. But at the same time, you'll have a very varied and exciting life. And, you know, I think a lot of people are doing it, but not for very much money. Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah. That's the problem.
OK, shall we have a look at your first
choice?
choice?
Yeah. Well, I have to say that the reason I became a hack was not because of Christine, but because before ever working in the day centre, I went to Uganda on VSO, and I had never, on voluntary service overseas. I had never been in a plane, literally, never been in a plane. I'd never been out of England. And the experience of going to Uganda was searing. I mean, it was unbelievable. I was plunged into a rural community 250 miles from Kampala on the banks of the Nile in a disused cotton shunting yard. It was an old sort of railhead, I suppose you could say, and all the classrooms were in the engine sheds and the rest of it. And there were only two Mzungus there, the two priests who ran this Catholic mission school. I was not a Catholic. At first, of course, I mean, if I'd had a mobile phone or the internet or some means of reaching home, I'd have said, come and get me. I mean, it was real. I was very, very homesick. It was an extreme experience. But after about 4 or 5 weeks, I completely fell in love with the place, largely because I began to understand that actually what I was looking at were people exactly like me, but just denied the opportunities I'd had. I remember writing on the blackboard and somebody making a rude noise in the front row, and I remember saying, "Who made that noise?" And the girl in the front row said, "That black boy at the back, sir." And I said, "But you're all black." And she said, "Ah, sir, some of us are much blacker than others." And I looked, and he was the most beautiful blue-black Nilotic boy from the Sudanese border, and she was Cappuccino from down in the southwest. And I realized I was actually in a room full of brunettes, redheads, blondes, you know, that they were as varied and variegated as I was. And we had at least as sophisticated arguments and discussions, but there were no books. You know, the thing was grotesquely short. My classes were often as big as the audience in this room, and some of them were older than I was because they'd had to earn the money to get to school in the first place. Some of them didn't go to school until they were 14. You know, it was a very, very sort of huge experience. Well, in the course of that experience, one of the things I had to do was to drive the school boxing team to Kampala for the national championships. And who should be refereeing the national championships but Idi Amin Dada. Idi Amin was then head of the army but not yet president. I was there under Obote Mark I. And he said to me, "You're very tall for a Mzungu. Your mother must have eaten much pawpaw." Well, my poor old mum never even heard of Waitrose, let alone the idea that there were any pawpaws available, or what they were they available? That's why I think, well, of course, the problem was that, in fact, in my very, very early days as a journalist, even while I was still at LBC, somebody came into the newsroom and said, "Has anyone ever been to Uganda?" And mine was the only hand that went up. And I went with Jim Callahan to rescue a white lecturer who'd written a very abusive book about him. A correct book, but an abusive one. And so Uganda really became the driver for going back to being a journalist, and that's what happened. And very early on in my career at ITN, I found myself in Uganda greasing up to this odious killer. And I'm not, I think, proud of this interview, but I'm proud of the fact that I did intersect with one of the great monsters of the 20th century. So here he goes.
Mr. Paul Enoch is a full supported by me on what he has said. Is not discriminating against any races, but he wanted the indigenous Londoners, their children, to have a bright future. He does not want England to be colonized by Africa, by Asia.
And do you agree with that?
London for Londoners, Scotland for Scottish, Wales for Welsh.
Well, Uganda for Ugandans.
Uganda for Uganda. Rhodesia for Zimbabwean people, not for the white minority regime. And South Africa and Southwest Africa for the black majority. But London can have any technical assistant, anybody they wanted to employ in London, but not to dominate the people of England.
Well, I mean, what he had to say was not particularly interesting, but except that he sided with Enoch Powell, who was, of course, which was interesting. The thing about Amin really was that he was both capable, as you can see there, of having a perfectly reasonable, if interesting and odd conversation. But he was also, he could, within a flash, turn to something very nasty indeed. There was a lovely Daily Express photographer called Bill Lovelace, and he got into the country illegally. I'd gone into the country legally. And Amin, who was at that stage dressed, he would be dressed in something different every day. He was dressed in a Stuart tartan. He had very big knees and a sporran. And he went for Lovelace and dragged him by the ear to the platform, paraded him in front of everybody and said, "This man's going to die," and threw him into jail. In fact, he didn't die, but he was badly beaten up there and then thrown out into the outer beyond and to return to Enoch Powell's land. So that was that. But so I would say Uganda was a thread in my early reporting career, and I've been back a good few times since, and still continue to sing the Ugandan national anthem as a party trick. It's very short. It's very short.
Why, did you see him in Saudi, John?
I didn't see him in Saudi. No, I don't think very few people ever did get to him in Saudi, but I did have the opportunity to kill him. Which in a way is one of those early things that confronts a journalist as to what the limits of your journalistic responsibilities actually are. Because one of the things he wanted to do was to take me to his village in West Nile, which required a plane. And the French, it would always be the French, had given him an executive jet, which was a Falcon, which I know many of you do spend a lot of time in executive jets, but you'll therefore know that they're very small, and there's a sort of row of seats down that side and a row of seats down that side. And we were slightly afraid that he was going to drive it himself, which he'd said he could, but didn't attempt to demonstrate while we were there. So there was a Swiss pilot, and we got onto this plane, my cameraman sitting in front of me, a very heavy-set air hostess behind me, and then suddenly the light drained from the cabin of the plane as Amin himself came into the fuselage. He was extraordinarily large. He got in and sat down in the seat next to me, and he was on that occasion wearing a full Texan Rangers uniform with a Stetson. And soon after takeoff, there was a very heavy noise coming from his direction. I realized he was snoring, and the Stetson was down over the face. And I looked down, and I mean, no further away than the bottle on this table. He might even have been nearer, just like that. And I looked down, and there was a gun hanging out of a holster. And I thought, should I shoot him? And I wondered what happens if you shoot a very fat man in a confined, pressurized cabin. Does the bullet ricochet around inside the girth?
Do you do a piece to camera at the same
time?
Well,
quite. I mean, why not? And or does it go out through the fuselage, and are you sucked out at the size of a pin out into the blue beyond? In any case, what will the Swiss pilot do if you do shoot him? And then you think, is it loaded? I mean, just suppose you went, oh shit, there's nothing in it. or I mean, and then you say, is he asleep? Gotcha! You know. So of course it was my failure of courage that allowed him to live a peaceful existence behind a swimming pool in Jeddah and die peacefully at the poolside a mere 7 years ago.
You said you weren't proud of that interview, John. If you were advising a young journalist, let's talk about the craft of interviewing a little bit, who was going to do an interview like that, not necessarily that one. How would you advise them to go about the interview beyond thinking of some questions?
I think it might have been a good idea not to have it at all. It was secured on extremely dubious grounds. I mean, basically, I got to know an extraordinarily evil man, I'm now going to commit live libel online, called Astor's. Astor's still alive, actually, in Wimbledon. How he's been allowed to live here, I don't know, but there he is. He's there in Wimbledon. And he was literally the Mr. Fix-It for Amin. And he was also the newscaster on Ugandan television. How he combined these two roles, I'm not sure. But I realized that he was the key to the door. And everyone in those days was desperate to interview Amin. I mean, everybody wanted to get into Uganda. I mean, he'd expelled 90,000 Asians. He had killed at least as many of his own countryfolk. I mean, he was an extremely desirable tyrant of the worst water. I mean, you know, if you want to do tyrants, they didn't get much better than Amin. And so there was a big sort of bounty on trying to get an interview with Amin. And I got the interview, but it wasn't worth getting. And very often that is what happens. You invest a huge amount in getting a really important interview, and then you can't really do anything with it because you ask the right questions, you may not escape the country. That's the problem. I mean, it was a problem because he was highly unpredictable. And he did kill some journalists, so he wasn't immune from that sort of thing.
Okay, should we look at your second?
Yes. Well, my second love, I would say really my first love in many ways. If I were ever asked to say where I'm most, the biggest challenge and also the most rewarding challenge is Iran. I think Iran is an absolutely mesmerizingly beautiful, amazing country with incredibly interesting people, some of the brightest and best educated people I've ever met anywhere in the world, an incredible culture. But of course, with a number of challenged individuals running the place, and of course, you know, a revolution which is you know, clearly experiencing some tensions and difficulties. But I was there, I first went there overland as a student. I soon made up for never having been out of the country, because as a student I drove to India in a bus and went through Iran then and loved it then. But I had the fantastic good fortune to be sent for the dying days of the Shah and the beginning of the revolution, and then to be there when the American hostages were seized. There's incredible thought these days, the idea that 52 US diplomats could be seized by a bunch of students and held for 444 days. It couldn't happen now. It just could not happen now. But it happened then. And nobody wanted to sort of bite the bullet. Nobody wanted to do anything about it. A fantastic sort of, an amazing gulf existed between the reality we were living on the ground in Tehran and what the State Department thought was going on. I mean, we were living on two different planets. Very soon after the hostages were seized, my office in London said, look, I'm terribly sorry, none of them are British, so we think you should come home. So I got onto ABC, whose correspondent had just been expelled, and I said, for God's sake, ITN had a relationship with ABC, get them to second me to you, and then I can stay. But sure enough, they got onto ITN, and I was seconded to ABC. And I worked on this amazing program that was spawned by the Iranian hostage crisis, which was called Iran in Crisis, America Held Hostage. Boom, 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 boom. And this was actually the forerunner of a program that is now called Nightline. And the initial presenter of this program was a guy called Ted Koppel. And Ted and I would talk every night. And Ted would ask me a question which quite literally didn't seem to me to have any feasible answer rooted in fact. I mean, the question was so far out of kilter with what was going on. So they imbued these people that were holding the hostages with incredible powers. I mean, for example, I was asked one night by Nightline whether I could, or by Iran held hostage, whether I could get the foreign minister, Sadek Gopburzadeh, they called him. We called him Gopsadeh, which is his actual name. Gopburzadeh. John, could you get Sadek Gopburzadeh to agree to do an interview with Cy Vance, the Secretary of State? Secretary of State's prepared to do it if you can get Cy Vance, if you can get Gopburzadeh to agree. And I would say, oh, that could be very difficult. Thinking, Christ, this would be good for the fees. Well, yeah, so you would go round to the foreign ministry where you'd literally go up to the door. There were no security, nothing.
Complete access.
Sadek, oh yes, come in. You'd come in. He'd been educated. For 20 years, he'd been a failed student in America, which was one of the reasons why he resented the Americans very considerably. He couldn't be one himself, and therefore he resented them very heavily. Anyway, he said, poor man, he's dead now, but met a grim end. Anyway, he said, I said, Sadek, I've got some good news for you, and some bad. He said, what's the good news? I said, Cy Vance wants to do a debate. When? What? What for? What time? What can we do? I said, well, the time is the problem. It's because of the time difference. It's going to be 4 o'clock in the morning. Oh, no problem at all. No, we'll do that. Absolutely. Now, the thing was, I could talk to Sadek Gopsadeh. I mean, the British ambassador could talk to him, as far as I could tell. Anybody could, but the Americans wouldn't. They said, it's far too dangerous. No way were they going to have it. These people were holding these hostages. It's absolutely outrageous and scandalous. You could even get into the embassy still in the early days. I mean, and talk to the students. I mean, and no one was more surprised than the students that they were still holding these people after a week. Well, then, of course, it developed its own momentum. And, of course, it got to the point where the Americans were telling the truth. They were not possible to negotiate with. They really did think they'd got the sort of world in their hands and the rest of it. Well, anyway, in the middle of this, Jimmy Carter decides he's going to try and rescue the hostages. And the most elite helicopter-borne squad is taken aboard a aircraft carrier into the Gulf down there, and it's going to fly up to within hailing distance of Tehran, refuel, and then go in, get the hostages, come out, and go back to it was a harebrained idea, but anyway, there it was. And, of course, a complete disaster struck. The 8 helicopters landed in the desert, no problem, and then the refueling plane came in. And it was a C-130, which depends on reverse thrust of the propellers to brake, to slow down. And, of course, in going into reverse thrust, it kicked up the most God almighty sandstorm. I mean, it was something the like of which you would never see naturally. It was so bad. And they couldn't see where they were going. They were doing everything by line of sight. There were no instruments anywhere in the desert to get a fix out of. And they crashed into the end helicopter. And because the Americans have been a bit lackadaisical about the parking rules, which are you must always be a very considerable distance between each other if you're going to be refueling in an ad hoc situation, the first one lit the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And all the guys in the first 4 were incinerated. And the thing was a complete and total catastrophe. Well, they put out some harebrained story about, there having been, some mechanical failure or whatever, but the truth was it was just a total bullseye. Well, then there was this fantastic dash to try and get there. And of course this was in the days of competitive news, when we really were up against the BBC, up against CBS and the rest of it. And the great thing was that the night that this had happened, there had been a bus going across the desert floor, and because it had gone straight past the incident, the Americans had to arrest, the surviving Americans had to arrest it, then arrest everybody in it and hold it until they'd got everybody that was still alive away. And so we thought the next night, well, we'll take the same bus. And we went to Yaz, which was where the bus had originated, found a driver, paid him $200. He put us under a tarpaulin at the back of the bus because no media were allowed there. And we were taken onto the site, and the Minister of Justice was waiting there, Ayatollah Khamenei, and he thought that we were an official delegation. So he entertained us, waving the limb of a dead pilot around his head like this, and there we were in this incredible site, and we were there alone. I mean, CBS caught us, but basically it was a fantastic scoop, and this was it. It's very grainy.
This is the core of the tragedy. First impressions might suggest that this is simply the wreckage of the giant C-130 transport plane. But this is the entire rotor assembly of one of the American helicopters that were involved in the rescue attempt. It was parked over here, and it was when it took off on a mistaken bearing that it sliced into the Hercules plane. That, at least, is the version that has flowed from America in the past few days. But a combination of factors that we found suggested the possibility that the Hercules had in fact ploughed into the helicopter. The ruts left behind in the aftermath of landing appear to have swerved to miss another helicopter. The reverse thrust of the plane's huge propellers blowing sand forward around the cockpit in pitch darkness may have persuaded the pilot that he'd passed the last helicopter. The propellers on the impact side are in smithereens, as if they hit something static whilst still in motion. Yet the helicopter blades are practically intact, suggesting they were not rotating. The molten aluminium marked the intense heat of the blaze which followed, so intense that no American could get near to drag clear the bodies in the wreckage. The strong implication that this plane had brought the helicopter's lifeblood, without which now the mission was doomed: the fuel. 100 yards away, the only other tracks left by a plane, those of another Hercules, the plane by which the Americans were now to escape. There was no sign that any other craft landed. Only 2 planes and 6 helicopters here then. So what happened to the others? Did they land elsewhere? Amid frantic moves to leave, the Americans splashed jet fuel on their grounded craft. They fired into some of them. 3 caught fire and were totally destroyed. 2 survived. One was even started by the Iranians themselves late last night. The bus people they let go. These terrified country folk fled the blaze, their worldly possessions left in a heap beyond the carnage. And the Americans, crammed desperately into the belly of one surviving plane, lifted off, comforting four desperately burnt compatriots, abandoning a scene of utter hopelessness and leaving behind any chance of rescuing 50 hostages held 400 miles beyond these desert wastes. Jon Snow, News at 10, at the American crash site in Iran.
Well, in those extraordinarily upper-class clipped tones, actually, every man his own aircraft crash investigator. Not a bad piece of hackery, actually. I mean, I haven't seen it in years. It's the first time I've seen it.
How many days after the actual crash was that?
The next day.
It was
the next day. I mean, absolutely amazing. Absolutely amazing. And then the absurd thing was that, of course, the Iranians wanted these pictures desperately. Well, half of them did, just like today. Half of them want you then, half of them don't. So half of them wanted the pictures out on the air to show what a complete catastrophe it was, and half of them wanted to shoot us. So when we got back into our bus, of course, in those days we were on film. That was all wild track. You know, I'd just done the commentary, recorded it, and they stitched it on. But we had 3 cans of 400 feet of Fuji Ektachrome or whatever it was. And the only safe place with the Revolutionary Guard roadblocks was to wear them in your underpants. And so we all looked fabulously well endowed. We each had a round tin of film in our crutches. And the interesting thing at an Islamic revolutionary roadblock is they will feel everywhere except around your most private elements. And so we got away with it. And when we got to Iran, when we got to Tehran, and thought, well, we're either going to put this up on the telly, we're going to put it on the satellite and try and get it out, or it's then of no value. We'll take a risk. And of course, they were falling over themselves to process it and to get it out on their own airwaves before they got it out on ours. It was fantastic. But then, as now, you never knew whether you were supposed to be allowed to do something or not. Mm-hmm. And you might have permission from this lot, but not from that lot, and then countermanded by that lot. So, you know, it was, nothing in that sense has changed. I've talked for far too long. El Salvador.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. I think obviously I've been very, very lucky because I came of reporting age during the Cold War, what is rather strange is that Ronald Reagan, when he was president of the United States, decided that the line in the sand in the Cold War had to be drawn in Central America. That actually this was the great threat to southern states of America. At one stage, he thought the border of El Salvador was actually Texas. He thought you walked over the border from El Salvador. He missed out Mexico, Guatemala, and you know, there we are. We forgive him because he was a rather lovely man. But anyway, there we are. He decided El Salvador, which was riven with incredible gap between rich and poor, peasants absolutely oppressed, oligarchs, you know, owning all the coffee and this, that, and the other. And but America was on the side of the army, who were on the side of the oligarchs, and who deployed the death squads to keep the peasantry at heel. I have no idea exactly what this bit is, but it's very important to me because it was really the first time I was ever sent anywhere where nobody seemed to have been before. You know, nobody had ever reported from El Salvador on ITN ever, and I was sent there in the aftermath of the murder of Archbishop Romero, who was the first archbishop, I think, to get a bullet, you know, at the high altar, which is where he got it. Let's see what was I doing? Who knows?
Just after dawn, leftist guerrillas who control much of the countryside here attacked a beer lorry out on the open road, a typical economic target designed to disrupt supplies. But a mile down the same road, rightists had attacked and horribly mutilated 3 men from the nearby town. People in passing buses simply stared and accepted it. And this is what the note left with the bodies reads: "Don't come back because we know about your actions, and what has happened to these people will happen to you." And it's signed EMN, which is an extreme right-wing paramilitary group. This kind of butchery, which is generally the activity of those on the right wing in this country, is the sort of thing which can be found on any roadside throughout El Salvador at this time. 6 hours later, a policeman lay dead in a pool of blood in the capital's main shopping precinct. But if these killings typify the day-to-day violence in El Salvador, events at the country's central police station exemplify the government's role in it. 21 university academics had been arrested and dragged from their meeting place. Over 100 police had been involved in the raid. Tanks and armoured cars had been used too. These people had been holding their regular weekly curriculum meeting. They've held it at the same time in the same way for years. But today the government says it was a subversive meeting. Almost certainly, due to pressure from international opinion, 13 of the academics are to be released. In the past, many have simply disappeared in this way, only to be found dumped dead in the city sometime later.
Well, you get a whiff of it. It was real Graham Greene, to be honest. Anyway, that was a sort of, that was a formative experience as a hack. Well, we'll quickly sport on.
Can I just ask a question about this? When David was saying that the nature of the pictures in the whole piece were really gruesome, and you'd be surprised if we saw that on television these days.
Yes, actually, there's a much grimmer piece which I thought I'd ordered up, but obviously failed, in a volcanic lava pit, where literally, I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of bodies were dumped, and they were all in various stages of decay, vultures. I mean.
But where do you stand on this argument about we should show more than we do at the moment?
I think there's no question whatever that we have become sanitised and oversensitive. But it's very difficult, if you've got children yourself.
Yeah.
I mean, they might be looking in, and are they able to distinguish between what they see on video and what is actually happening in real life and all that? I think it is a challenge, but I think that in a situation in which you are yourselves engaged in war, I think it's important that the populace see the consequences of it. No war is without bodies, and it's an amazing thing. We never see any bodies.
And you did 3, in your book you said you did 3-month stints in El Salvador. That's extraordinary, isn't it?
Amazing. No, we really committed.
I can't imagine ever doing that.
We committed. Yes. No, we're here today, gone tomorrow. Haiti, I was there for 6 days or 8 days. No, in those days, they would cast you off. So you go and see what's going on, old chap. And you'd ring up at some point, of great expense, or get on the telex, and you say, we think we should be in Guatemala. Well, pop down there, see what's going on. There's a chap called Rios Montt. He's a bit of an extremist, but he could be quite a character on television. Should we go and see what he looks? Yes, you go down and see what's going on. There was an incredible laissez-faire sort of feel about it. And of course, things got on 3 days after you'd shot them, so they weren't exactly hot. But then it didn't matter because no one had ever been there before, so it was all right. No, we wouldn't do that now.
Okay. Should we move to the cold?
How easily we could, though. How easily we could.
Meaning, how do you mean?
Well, I mean, we got all the gear,
Yeah.
got lots of people, but we haven't got the will. It's too risky. Not risky from a life and death point of view, but will we ever get it on?
Will you get a story on you?
Will we get a story? You'll always get a story if you go. I can't think of ever being sent anywhere and not coming back with a story, even if it had nothing whatever to do with why I was sent. But that doesn't matter, as long as it's a story.
Should we move to the anxiety of the Cold War?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's impossible really to describe to all you young people. Well, you and I together. But I mean, basically, I mean, it's impossible to describe how absolute the Cold War was. I mean, how absolute the division was. How you grew up certain that the world would stay exactly as it was. That East Germany would always be East Germany. There would always be a wall. That there was no possibility that the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire would ever disintegrate. No question. I mean, it just never crossed our minds. So that when this strange man with a wine stain became the Secretary General and the leader of the Soviet Union, and this strange B-movie star who was currently the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, who devoted enormous quantities of rhetoric to saying how utterly evil the evil empire actually was. He conjured the phrase. or somebody conjured it for him, but he delivered all phrases extremely well, as befits a B-movie star. But the combination of the new man on the block, who was incredibly zesty after all the old fossils who had died in office, a cascade of dead leaders had moaned their way across Red Square in boxes. And here was Ronald Reagan, who threatened to moan his way across Washington in a box, which was still standing at 70x. But the idea these two people would in some way speak, it was such a shock to the system. And the very first summit between Reagan and Gorbachev was an absolutely stunning moment. I mean, it was, in a way, it was impossible to do justice to it. It was so big an event. And the idea that these people would talk at a very early stage about a scale of peace that we haven't yet recognized now. I mean, in the summit, there was a series of about 5 or 6 of these summits, one of which took place in Reykjavik, in which both men talked about actually clearing the planet of all nuclear weapons. I mean, all nuclear weapons quickly. They had to be rowed back, and various people like Richard Pearl banged their heads on the walls to try and stop the talk, but it happened. And I don't know quite what happens here, but I think this is in Geneva. It's at a chateau, which was the location for this meeting. I do remember the celebrated ABC White House correspondent Sam Donaldson, who was a character at the time, asking Gorbachev whether he had iron teeth. And Gorby thinking it was very funny, which was a tremendously positive sign, because the idea that any Soviet leader would think that the suggestion that he had iron teeth was funny was very enlightened. I mean, anyway, let's see what happens.
Russian officials waiting tonight in Geneva to receive a once unlikely American guest, Ronald Reagan. Schultz and Shevardnadze, foreign ministers both, have met before, but until today, Messrs. Reagan and Gorbachev never. Tonight, Reagan's and Gorbachev's greeted each other as if old friends for dinner at the Soviet mission. By now, the two leaders must almost feel they've known each other for days. That was not the case this morning, as blazing lights and dense security announced Reagan's motorcade en route to the summit's opening session. The site, a millionaire's chateau with sharpshooters on the rooftop scouring the countryside with binoculars in the cold, as Reagan, below in a window, sent thumbs-up signals to the cameras, awaiting the Russians' arrival. With Gorbachev on the move, there were more lights as rare Russian limos, flown in specially for today, carried Gorbachev alone, hatted in the back. 1,000 million homes will view what happened next. Gorbachev out, face brimful of confidence, the leaders of the world's greatest power blocks, strangers to each other, shaking hands. Face to face, in this the first superpower summit encounter in 6 years. For only the 8th time in 25 years, Russian and American leaders side by side. Their words we could not hear, and perhaps they could not actually even understand them either.
Very fast delivery there. I don't know what was going on exactly, but who knows. But those clipped tones, my goodness me, what a chap.
Were you Washington correspondent then?
What?
Were you Washington correspondent?
I was Washington correspondent.
So you went from the States?
I went from the States, and what fun to be in the...
plane. Were you actually on Reagan's plane?
Yeah, on Reagan's plane. It was absolutely fantastic. They had a few, third worlders like us at the back, and then Sam and the key figures would be up the front. Wonderfully hierarchical, but we were tolerated. In fact, I don't think one is ever more than tolerated in the States. One is always a third world correspondent. It's such fun at conventions, you're always creeping about looking for the crumbs.
See, humility aside, you joined ITN in '76.
Yes.
And were Washington correspondent by 1983.
Yeah.
That's an extraordinary...
Meteoric rise. Nepotism again, I suspect.
Was it, you think
probably. I don't
so you
know.
met Peter a lot?
No, I don't know. No, he'd gone. He'd gone to the BBC. But, no, I don't know. I mean, look, I wasn't pissed.
Should we go straight on to our...
Yes, quickly, yes. Yeah. Well, of course, if Reagan and Gorby were the sort of, great sort of breakthrough moment in East-West, of course, the other thing that was happening was Southern Africa, and as Vin has mentioned, I got thrown out of university. It was basically because we had a sit-in in protest against the university's holdings, Liverpool University's holdings in Tate and Lyle, which had a huge presence in South Africa, and therefore the university's investments were essentially in apartheid South Africa. And me, flushed with having come back from Uganda, and others, felt this was quite intolerable, and that the investment should be disinvested. As a result of that, and as a result of being arrested for assaulting a policeman, which I didn't do because I got off, I was freed, I was cleared. But I sort of did do, but no, he put his knee in my groin and I put my knee in his groin. But anyway, the thing was that meant actually that I was banned from South Africa all my reporting life until Mandela was freed, because Boss had me on a list. Then he was freed, and then, as you know, he eventually became president in '94, and I got to interview him, and of course that's something which I mean it's so incredible to have been allowed, when he was absolutely at the peak of his powers of forgiveness but not forgetfulness, and I think that this sort of build-up, because he had such a towering reputation in the world, was almost intimidating. And yet when he came into the room, he was the most natural of men. Nobody had trained him in any media activity. He never diverted from the question. If you asked him a question, he actually gave you the answer. He addressed the question you had asked. And in a very curious sort of way, he seemed to be even more interested in you than you were in him. The 27 years in jail had in some way made him voraciously hungry for contact with strangers. That's all I can sort of say. And so I'm sure this doesn't achieve anything.
What year is this, John?
This is, I think, 1990.
I have not the slightest hesitation that the government of national unity will be established. It will work very effectively, and the plans to better the life of our people that we have developed will be put into practice.
Now, a lot of this achievement has been dependent upon the relationship between you and Mr. de Klerk. When we spoke to him the other day, he said, well, I have a very good formal relationship with Mr. Mandela. I call him Mr. Mandela and he calls me Mr. State President. If you're going to go forward from that point, will that relationship have to sustain and, if anything, even get closer, or do you see the work already done?
Well, my relations, firstly, I don't think it is correct to think of the future in terms of the contribution of just two individuals. Although individuals are important, the changes in this country have not been brought by a single individual. It is the men and women of South Africa from all population groups who have exerted tremendous pressure, who came out into the streets, held strikes, boycotts, who were harassed and persecuted by the racist police of the apartheid regime, who were thrown into the jail, who were shot and killed, with the support of the international community, which has been absolutely massive and tremendous. It is that pressure that has made the apostles of apartheid to collapse, to go down on their knees, and to bring about changes. But within the background, individuals have played a role. You must put, therefore, the contribution of any individual as against that background.
Amazing, lovely, wise thought, just coming out like that, fantastic. And it does make you think how we'll manage when he dies, because it'll be an absolutely massive global event. It's hard to imagine any single death on the planet in our lifetime. I hate to speak like that, but I mean, it'll come one day. And how we'll manage. It will be massively emotional, and perhaps not for younger people, but I think because people will be brought to recognize what he did and what he stands for, in this issue of forgiveness, but not forgetting. I mean, is so powerful, and such an extraordinary consequence of such outrageous contempt for human rights. It's an amazing thing Mandela's contribution, and you become a bit inured to it now because he just is there. But anyway,
I think it will be a huge thing for young people as well, actually.
yeah,
Judging by my own children.
Yeah, because he's now taught.
Yeah. Can I ask you about Africa generally? You talked about your time in Uganda earlier on, and you've been quite critical of the prism through which the Western media looks at the developing world sometimes. And what do you do? What do you personally do when you're reporting from, let's say, Africa, to avoid a kind of Western, white, Northern Hemisphere approach to your stories?
Well, I suppose the fact of having lived for a year, as equals, or even less than equal, I mean, even sort of inferior in some ways, and because you're learning all the time. I mean, I suppose you do try to look at it through the eyes of the people who live it, rather than through the eyes of us. I mean, it is very, very easy to go to all sorts of developing countries and say this is intolerable and impossible and all the rest of it, and to lose sight of how people live their lives. And of course what's amazing is that people live remarkable social lives. The extended family is still, withering fast, but still, particularly in West Africa, very, very intact. I did a documentary in the year 2000, which was travelling up the millennium, up the meridian line, the Greenwich Meridian, and an ethnic Ghanaian came down the line, and we met on the roof of the central mosque, and we both had the most extraordinary experiences getting there. I met a man in Burkina Faso who did not know the world was round, but he was the chieftain in the village, and it was an incredible. I lived in the village for about 4 or 5 days, and it was an incredibly sophisticated organisation. The way the huts were sorted out, where the wives were, what roles people played, how everyone was cared for, how aged. The idea of an old people's home in Burkina Faso would be very hard to explain, as I've discovered. There were lots of ways in which they were actually living better lives than we were. And yet they were, of course, in a sort of global sense, living a terrible life by comparison with that. They didn't have electricity, or running water, etc. And yet they did have respect for old people, and they would sit at their knees and learn from them very actively. And if a problem cropped up, they'd go and consult them. Say, how did you deal with this?
I'm just wondering whether we should play the three.
Yeah, play these characters.
We're now going on to the competition.
Yes. Yeah, well,
I'm
the
just
first
wondering whether
guy,
we should play the three of them together.
Why not? Let's sling them in. I just speak very quickly in introducing all three. Are there 3 people that I've met in the field and who I admire hugely? Very sadly, Brian Barron died last year, or was earlier this year. Brian was stationed in East Africa when I was sort of effectively based there as well, and he was the most ruthless competition. But he was also a very brilliant journalist, very, very engaged on the ground. But, we got up to all sorts of tricks to try and outflank each other. I remember trying to track a deserting general from Amin's army who had fled into Kenya, into northern Kenya. And we discovered where he was. And Brian was also looking with his team. And we got to a town, and they were very hot on our heels. And I remember Mohinder, my Indian, ethnic Indian cameraman, Sikh cameraman, and I dashing into this cafe and hiding under one of the tables as Brian's Land Cruiser went past the open door. And that was the sort of idiotic thing you would do. Much worse than that, though, was the celebrated moment when Brian would be based in Nairobi, and I would never be based anywhere relevant. For some reason, I was in Dar es Salaam. They would only allow one plane in. I think Brian had seen to it, that they would only allow one plane in from Kenya each night to pick up film, and that would be the BBC plane. So everybody's stuff would go out except ours. And we'd have to get a plane from Dar es Salaam, which was much less efficient and much further away, and had no satellite point anyway. It was a complete disaster. And one night, we had got some absolutely terrific footage, and he knew it. and he got to the airport before us and told our pilot that he could go, that we weren't coming back that night. And Mohinder we arrived at the airport to see our plane coming down the runway, and Mohinder jumped onto one of these porter's trucks and drove out onto the runway to block the plane taking off. But anyway, that sounds far too underhand.
He's so charming, Brian, as well, isn't he?
But he was absolutely lovely, and very helpful. But he was a very, very good correspondent. You would very rarely ever beat him to the story. Martin Bell, who I respected enormously, and I worked with a lot in both Central America and in the United States when he was based in Washington. We overlapped a bit. But I suppose the guy I would rate now as being the best television journalist of his time is Matt Fry of the BBC, who I hope wouldn't mind me saying I think his best material was when he was in the Far East, where he delivered some of the most amazing films. But he can produce fabulous films, and did an incredible one in New York, as you'll see. So quick roll of all three bits.
The last helicopter came in for a handful of US Marines, a humiliating end to the American presence. 1 mile away outside our hotel, the final disintegration of law and order was taking place. Groups of looters began straggling past with goods stolen from abandoned American quarters. We tried to show our neutrality, the fact that we were not Americans, by fixing a Union Jack to our hired car. Most Vietnamese were fully engaged in plunder. Minutes to 9 on the morning of the final American departure. The last Americans left the embassy complex about 25 minutes ago, and the fate of the embassy is very clear. It's now being systematically looted from floor to floor, and part of the building has been set on fire.
That was Vietnam, obviously, final day.
The British then took their patrol through Arundhati, where the worst of these atrocities was alleged to have occurred. This is or was a Muslim village of some 400 people. Every one of the Muslim houses was burnt to the ground. Down the road, the fallen minaret was the very symbol of ethnic cleansing. The infantry then went on a foot patrol to look for more casualties or evidence of atrocities. They didn't have far to search. They came upon a house in the center of the village where a family of 7 had died, 2 in the stairway, another 5 in the cellar. It's hard to look at some of these pictures, harder to tell the story of Arundhati without them. What happened here can frankly not be shown in any detail, but the room is full of the charred remains of bodies, and they died in the greatest agony. It's hard to imagine, in our continent and in our time, what kind of people could do this.
Remember, it was on a perfect late summer's day, just like this one, that the unthinkable happened. Much has been said and written about how the world changed exactly 1 year ago, but this morning it was private grief that mattered. This was one of 5 processions led by pipers from the fire brigade, heading to Ground Zero. A year ago, at this very hour, these people were rushing to work, coffees and bagels in hand. It was just another Tuesday in Manhattan. But today, the city that never kept quiet was lost for words. This was their destination, a giant crater in Manhattan, America's open wound, now eerily swept clean.
So maybe I could just end with a current thing. We can talk about all these characters and all that. Shall we? Shall I?
The most interesting thing about Matt is that English is not his first language.
No, amazing. German, yeah.
German. It's extraordinary. Yeah, should we do the last one? Then we'll
I mean, still, if somebody asks me, I would say I'd rather be remembered as a reporter than as a presenter. you know, I think reporting is the gold star of what we do, and I feel very privileged to be allowed to be a reporter, and I'm still allowed to be a reporter on Channel 4 News, though not enough. But I was sent to Haiti, and that was a very, very testing assignment, because unlike the Pakistan earthquake, for example, which I went to in the Kashmir one, in which 85,000 people died, you could get to the edge of it and there would be infrastructure, it would be something you can hang on to and work with. But in Haiti, there was absolutely nothing at all. Every aspect of civic life had been decapitated. The UN had been decapitated, the American embassy, everybody had suffered loss, and every Haitian family had suffered loss. And even the NGOs, you would come up to the director of Oxfam and find that she'd had to spend the morning burying her mother, who had died in her house up on the top. And it was very, very challenging, but there was something about it which was also very interesting, which was that as a journalist, we were returned to our roots. We were returned to our roots as journalists. We could only transmit our own material. Nobody could cut in a picture from somewhere else. Everything had to be what you had seen. And that's very rare, because nowadays any reporter package almost invariably has the work of 20 other people cut into it. Somebody will say, I've seen a wonderful shot of a woman running down the street, must have that. Will you write to it, Arthur? You know, you're down in the field. And you want to say, no, bugger it. I haven't seen the woman running down the street. I have something altogether different. I believe reporting is about one pair of eyes communicating with one pair of eyes. One human being allowed, being privileged enough to witness something on behalf of somebody else and allowing them to share it. And I don't think it works if you have to squirt 50 people's pairs of eyes and try to condense them into one report. And suddenly in Haiti, because the engineering was so rudimentary, you could only slash together your own report on the back bumper of a Jeep, cut it together on 2 laptops driven by the car battery. You could probably hear the engine as you try and do your commentary, and put it up on a rudimentary satellite, and the people in London would just have to take whatever they got. The mobiles didn't work, so the bloody news desk didn't ring you and say, oh, and by the way, could you just remember to get X and Y and Z and a bit of L in? No, you don't get anything. You get what I'm sending you. You sent me as the reporter you trust. I'm going. Here's what I'm going to do. And so I don't know what I've actually got here, but something I did in Haiti.
Ice in Port-au-Prince. The first swallow of some tiny sense of revival. Suddenly, commerce too on the street. Adeline's first day out with bags of breadfruit. She makes a sale. She's lucky. For the rest, old produce piles high. Hyperinflation is at large. Water up 300%. Rice up 60%. Cooking oil $10 a gallon last week, $20 this. Where once the mini-market stood, there is nothing. 90% of such places in the city are destroyed or closed. Is anybody buying? It is in this moment that Nadia appears to urge us into her devastated community. You need toilets, you need food, you need water. Has nobody been here? No person?
You enjoyed that, didn't you?
Well, it got more interestingly. I mean, yeah, no, it was amazing because we found a UN interpreter. And the interesting thing was that for the first 3 or 4 days, you only ever heard, hey, I mean, obviously people speaking French or Creole. But suddenly when we got somebody speaking English, the power of their description of what had happened to them and what was happening to them was just extraordinary. I mean, one shouldn't be so xenophobic as to suggest that in some way it had a greater quality, but there was something about somebody telling us in our vernacular what had happened that was very powerful.
Okay. I just want to finish with one question, then we'll ask, throw it open to the floor. You said in your book, there was a very powerful line that we should forget the war on terror and wage a war on ignorance. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there is a vast amount of ignorance. I mean, well, the war on terror, I think, was a fatuous sort of concept from the very outset. I mean, you can't have a war on a noun anyway. We've tried wars on drugs, we've tried wars on poverty, we've tried, you know, and it seemed to me the war on terror, well, indeed, history has told us the war on terror went the same way as the war on drugs and everything else. And it seemed to me that that what we lacked in this whole problem of 9/11 was a context in which to try to fathom what on earth could have driven people to do what they were doing. What kind of benighted world could have spawned such a thing? And of course, we are ignorant about countries that we intersect with. We're very ignorant about Saudi Arabia, for example. I mean, why has nobody ever really tried to get to the bottom of why there were 17 Saudi hijackers? What is it about Saudi Arabia? What is it about Wahhabism? Why don't we know much more about the world in which we live? Because if we did, I don't think we would need a war on terror.
And do you see that as the responsibility of television news to supply that context?
Yeah, in part, absolutely, yes, yes. I mean, you know, I think you could count the number of reports we've ever seen on Saudi Arabia on one hand. And why is that? Because the Saudis don't let you in, and unless you go as a tame rabbit. And we have an obligation. We have an obligation to fill in the gaps that governments don't want to discuss. No government that takes the vast majority of its oil out of Saudi Arabia and sells the vast majority of its exported weapons to a country is going to want any examination of what that country is about. And, I mean, the truth of the matter is that if Saudi Arabia didn't have oil, we would be absolutely horrified, A, at the treatment of women internally, B, at the export of a particular view of Islam, which is not mainstream. Yeah, it's interesting.
Okay. We've got about half an hour for questions. So, 2 rules.
Don't feel you have to stay.
One question, I dare anyone to go. One question only, please. And could you wait for the microphone so that it works on the internet? So, question down here.
Thanks for that, John. One question I want to ask
This woman is a plant. She's a doctor. It's amazing. And she's also made unbelievable documentaries and a wonderful radio documentary for Woman's Hour and all sorts of other stuff. But she actually does A&E in Glasgow most of the time. Well, in London now,
answer your
isn't it?
question? Is that,
Sorry.
Far more interesting.
How was she allowed in?
I just wanted to ask, out of all the stories that you've covered and all the events that you've seen, what's the one story that's really got your goat, kept you awake at night, disturbed you, moved you out of all your experience?
Actually, I think very early on, El Salvador, it was the discovery that the United States was supporting the people who were controlling the death squads. In other words, they had the power to stop this killing, and they didn't use it. Indeed, they, at the time, they fostered it. You know, it's as bad as that. And the West generally was so ignorant about El Salvador anyway, that they had no interest in using their purchase on the United States to think again. And interestingly, NGOs, particularly the Catholic Institute for International Relations, Oxfam, there were very courageous NGOs who did draw attention to it, but it had no effect. And that made me very angry, yeah.
Who's next?
None.
Don't be shy. Come on, don't be shy.
Sal, have another.
In the last 10 years, then?
Oh, no, God save us. Angry? No, I'm not made angry generally.
Okay, got someone over there. Stick your hand up and I'll come to you as soon as possible.
I've got a question for John about foreign coverage. Do you think as TV stations and newspapers cut back on both bureaus and trips for parachute reporting, what do you think is going to fill that hole in terms of, you know, people on the ground? I was based in Mexico for 3 years and did sort of a lot of one-man band VJing, and that was definitely gaining traction. But I mean, what do you see filling that hole?
Well, I would like to see, I think the BBC is beginning to follow the same track. I want to see every news organisation, every TV news organisation have an independent budget, i.e. a budget which is ring-fenced only for deploying independence. People who are either living in Mexico or people who offer to go and have got some particular reason for us to believe in them because they've got good contacts or great filming capacity or whatever it is. I think if you have an independent budget which can only be spent on these kind of enterprises, and that's how we work at Channel 4 News. Then I think you have a very good chance of protecting some element of foreign news. But I actually think that news organisations will recover their confidence. The fact is actually, although I'm sitting here in the shadow of a very seasoned foreign editor indeed, the fact is it's possible to do foreign coverage, quite inexpensively if you're clever. And the need to get it on today is not great. We sent on a bonkers story the other day with our independent fund, this extraordinary cleric who's been in the bush in Peru, whipping up the locals against BP going to drill there. And he's made a damn nuisance of himself and is much loved by the indigenous Indians and the rest of it. And the Peruvians want to chuck him out. Not anymore, they don't, because the international community's found out about it, partly because we have an independent who is there, who called us up and said, this is happening. We sent a reporter. That was the only expense, because we had him on a retainer. We sent a reporter. He spent 5 days digging around, got a great story, came out and did it. That is the way we're going to have to go. Not all news has to be, today. We're living too much at the beck and call of 24-hour television. I'm a great admirer of 24-hour television, but it ain't the whole story, and never can be and never will be. We can be the whole story, and we should be, and there are ways of doing it. And I don't want to stay in a 5-star hotel, particularly if I'm going to a place where people, where you're trying to identify with and therefore understand from their perspective how people are in that situation. The 2-star will do fine.
Let's go down here. Come to you.
It is, yeah, we can hear you.
I was wondering actually about freedom of the press, freedom in broadcasting, your experience there. Say since September the 11th, what restrictions perhaps you have faced or other people in your newsroom have faced when it's come to reporting? Have there been limitations, sometimes on the editorial agenda, or has there been a government agenda that's kept into your newsroom?
No, I think we have a very, very free press. I'm not conscious of limitations. I think the limitations on bodies and blood on television, that's an issue. But politically, I don't think, I'm afraid there is a bit of a rebel in me, and if somebody did say to me, you can't do this and that, I would definitely do it. That's a problem. It's a problem I have. If I'm told not to do something, I do tend to want to do it. I was told never to wear bright colours on television. and so the little bit of rebel that's still not quite yet dead wears it round my neck. I honestly, I'm on the lookout for that, and I've never seen it. I really can't think of things which we've not been... I'm a bit squiffy about the Intelligence Committee, etc. That could do with cleaning up, because, clearly we don't have even a smidgen of an idea what the intelligence community gets up to, and probably won't learn much from this inquiry either. Somebody will get blamed for the torture, but I don't know. I'm not very confident. But other than that, I'm not in any way aware of agendas being cramped, or we're our own best crampers. We don't really need any help from anyone else.
Okay, down here. I'll come to you. Is that working?
Is my boss here? Are you here?
Jim.
No, Jim isn't here. No. But Dorothy Byrne, I think, might be. Are you here, Dorothy? She threatened to be here.
John, over here.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Has he said anything that...
Oh, incredible, how shattering. I completely forgot you were going to be here. Right. Sanitised answers from now on. I haven't done anything wrong yet, we said.
Can we have a question about the Channel 4 management?
Person, by the way.
Please, your question.
Sorry.
Hi there. How powerful is the media in influence in shaping our opinions, or is it the other way around? Is it us that influence the media?
Well, I think it's on the swing, in a funny sort of way. I mean, the incredible sort of surges that you get on Twitter, from time to time, can't possibly be without influence. You immediately thank good God. I mean, hearing from people immediately. Look, when I started at Channel 4 News, the only way anyone could communicate with me, the only way anybody ever did communicate with me, was green ink underlined in red, about 3 letters a week, and occasional phone calls to the station, which rarely ever got as far as yourself, as it were. Now you are absolutely bombarded by what people think. And that's got to be good. The only problem is living a life beyond it. Because it takes so long to cope with email, Twitter, blog, My day starts at 6, because I'm a slave to the machine, the thing, that screen, your inbox and the Twitter sphere, you can't let this stuff go by. You have to, let something go. So I think, oddly enough, from a one-way street, we are rapidly in a two-way conversation, and I don't think you can survive very long ignoring what people are saying, and I think undoubtedly we used to think what was good for the viewer. Now the viewer lets us know in spades.
Okay, we go. Yeah, the black shirt. Thank you.
I was just wondering, if you had the power to solve one kind of important issue of the day, what would you choose and why?
Well, I would be torn between Kashmir and Palestine. Do you call that an issue? Yeah.
They'll do.
And I think, actually, I would do what they did in Versailles. I think I would lock all the leaders in one room and tell them to sort themselves out, give them 6 months, and shoot anybody who failed to come up with a solution. I think it's quite incredible that the world hasn't said, sorry, but actually we have to solve this, and we are going to solve it, and we are going to depute the following people to do it, and we will live with the consequences. It's such a low priority, it's so extraordinary that it isn't absolutely at the top of everybody's agenda, because it's infecting every population on Earth, one way or another, and of course it's awful for the people who have to live it on all sides in the arena in which it is being fought out. So if I had the power, I genuinely would say we are going to have an open-ended conference, and nobody will be allowed to leave until something can be produced, and included within that conference obviously would be the combatants. And it would have the force of sanctions and all the sort of world's economic might to ensure that whatever came out of it worked. I don't know. There's a Hitlerian solution for you.
Question down here.
Hello, John. I fear you may edit your answer now that you've glanced to your right, but...
No, she's very permissive.
With a few days' reflection, you know what I'm going to ask you now, would you have handled last week's exchange with Zach Goldsmith differently? And also, what was the opinion of the editing, producing team afterwards?
Do you want to just explain briefly what happened, John? So the people
in fact, through our independent fund, we are currently doing some work on looking at whether people who ran for Parliament kept within their election expenses, which are extremely low. You're not allowed to spend more than about 11,000. And one of the people we looked at was the MP for Richmond and Twickenham, Zach Goldsmith. And we wanted to ask him various questions about what we discovered, because funnily enough, they have to lodge all their receipts with the town hall, and you can go and inspect them. But then you can look at the return which has been made to the election commission. And there were some questions we wanted to ask, and we asked the questions for about a week, and then eventually put the piece out. And then he came on live on Friday. The interview was mainly dominated by the way in which we had or hadn't handled the interview possibilities before the transmission of the main piece. So it was complicated. I think I can only say I would have handled it better, but I don't think I'd have handled it differently. Better. Everything one could do better. Everything.
What was the reaction of your editor, or the reaction of the editor or production team afterwards? Did they feel it was good television?
Well, I can answer that.
Yeah. I knew you'd come for a purpose.
No, it was an absolutely excellent piece of journalism, and all the proper approaches were made for appropriate rights to reply. And if somebody's invited on to Channel 4 News, that's a great honour for them. And it would be good if they did the honour of actually answering the questions put to them. So we were very pleased with the piece, and we will continue to pursue this subject. I'd say, and well done, John.
Quite right.
Yeah, this young woman has had her hand
I
up
beg
for a
your
bit.
pardon.
In the middle there,
In the middle.
dark hair.
What do you think of the idea of the licence fee being reduced? Would you be for it, or do you think it's a bad idea?
I've never worked for the BBC, and it is still, for me, quite an underexplored experience. I mean, I'd like to see the licence fee more progressive, to be honest, because I think it is extremely high for somebody who's unemployed and the rest of it. So rather than reduce the licence fee, I'd like to see it made more progressive. But of course, that would be expensive to work out. You know, I am somebody who depends massively on the BBC. I basically received most of my information orally. I'm a complete radio fanatic. I absolutely love it as a medium, and it suits the way in which I absorb information. So obviously I would defend to the death the best of BBC radio for me, and that would go for music as well as spoken word. I think whatever it takes for the BBC to do what it does best, I would want to see protected. But I don't have a strong view. You know, I imagine, as in everywhere else in the economy, there are areas of waste, and probably you could reduce something somewhere. But as I say, I'd rather see poorer people forgiven the licence fee on a larger scale than all of us pay less.
Okay.
What would be your hunch about
God, hacks and hunches. Whew.
a big story out there in the world somewhere today that's crying out to be told? You've mentioned the Saudi Arabian situation, inside scoop, what's going on out there. What would be something you'd really love to dig up that you think is out there, ready to be dug up?
Oh, that's a big question. I don't know. I am intrigued by money and how it is controlled and who does what. And I'm interested in the role of Russian money. There seems to be a fair amount of complicity outside Russia in some of what happens inside Russia. And I think money is an interesting area to pursue, but it's a very dodgy thing to get involved with. A lot of people have died in the effort in Russia. But a friend of mine has a real theory that in some way oligarch money was used to pull the world's financial system back from the brink. But I've not been able to lay a finger on it yet.
Okay, question down here.
Good evening. Now, you said in your book that you believe there's no such thing as a neutral journalist. Indeed, that there's no such thing as a neutral human being.
Not an unreasonable claim.
No. But can journalists ever be accused of being, say, overly objective if the evidence strongly leans towards one particular view?
Well, I mean, I think there is a danger about being overly objective. I think you have to report what you see. So I don't really think you need to be thinking about whether you're going to be overly objective. The question is, are you going to attempt to report what you perceive to be the truth and what you can verify with a reasonable amount of research and facts and the rest of it. But I can't say I can ever remember reporting a story and thinking, I often think, well, this is what you think, John, but you're a bit of an arsehole, really. So what do you think other people think, particularly the people who are caught up in this? What do they think? And I do think life as a journalist is very often about really trying to get into the head of somebody, you know, I mean, and try and see how the world looks to them. You know, and I think that that's one of the problems in the Middle East, that people don't try to get inside the heads of people who live the life there, who get inside the head of Israelis who live there and of Palestinians who live there and perceive how it could be. And you feel that neither of them do either, and that's a problem. But I don't look for aggressive objectivity. It seems to be a bit of a killer.
Can I just ask you a question about that, John, from a slightly different angle? You're a patron, because of the nature of the guy you are, you're a patron or a trustee of all sorts of things. Do you think the BBC was mistaken in asking George Alagai, or telling George Alagai, to stand down as the patron of the Fair Trade Association?
I didn't know they had, which shows me as rather ignorant. I mean, I think one of the things which it is important for journalists to do is to be part of the community. One of the problems, I think, is that journalists live antisocial hours and not generally able to afford the time to be the school governor, etc., because you can't make the meetings, are not often engaged in the community in that way, and therefore don't get the chance, you know, to see what life is actually like a lot of the time, especially if they travel a lot. So that I think that if you can engage with something, you should. And fair trade seems to me a sort of fairly, you know, kind of safe thing. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, working for the BBC is obviously, you know, much more challenging thing.
Tell me about it. There was someone in the middle. Yes, there. Sorry. Do you want to stick your hand up so we can see you? Thank you.
Hi. John, you've been to all sorts of trouble spots in the world as well. How do you view the sort of role of media and journalists in situations where the other side might sort of exploit media as such, i.e. hostage takers? They get their business out of the media paying attention to what they're doing and things like that. I mean, I'm not saying that you should take sides or so on, but what is your impression about the role of media in that one?
Well, I'm perfectly happy to go with blackouts, etc. If there, I mean, there have been a lot of blackouts with the Chandlers, because there have been moments when we've all hoped they would come out, and we still do. I think that's right. I mean, to deprive the thing of the oxygen of publicity is perfectly acceptable. You know, we are humanitarians as well. We can't divorce ourselves from the welfare of people who are in terrible trouble. I think you do have to make a judgment as to whether you are actually contributing and facilitating some greater evil than you know, what is on hand. I think you do have to think about it. That's all I would say. It should be a consideration, and it should invade your thinking.
Okay.
Hiya, you described speech radio as the ultimate medium. I was wondering if you were personally upset about Channel Radio 4 not working out, and I was wondering whether podcasts could maybe fill the space.
I was very sad that Channel 4 Radio didn't work out. I thought 4 Radio sounded so much better than Radio 4 in a funny sort of way. But you know, it's extremely expensive, and I'm not surprised it didn't work out. No, I don't think anyone's going to be able to challenge the BBC really for the spoken word, and it does require a license fee to do it. You just cannot do it commercially. You know, commercial radio in this country has really fundamentally been a failure, and it's very sad, seeing as I was in on the beginning of it. But I think it's partly because our culture kind of grew up with. It's an amazing thing, you know, when I started in journalism, well, the day I started was the day the state stranglehold on radio was broken, 1973. It was an amazing thing, as recently as that, there was only one radio source, legal radio source. And I think actually it was too great a setback ever to recover from. Of course there are exceptions that you know, are making money, but not much.
Okay, 2 final questions. There's one over here, this guy in the white shirt by the wall here.
Perhaps he's a neutral journalist.
Flaccid, even.
Hi, John. My head's teeming with questions, but I'm going to ask you this one. I was quite struck by what you were saying about the notion of ignorance, and that you feel that there's too much ignorance, and clearly you play a very powerful role in either maintaining that status quo or not, as the case may be. Hopefully not, I think, in your case. But probably one of the most important historical issues overseas vis-a-vis the West is Iraq. And I just wonder whether I feel quite strongly from my point of view and my research that there were huge institutional constraints on the proper reporting of Iraq leading up to 2003 and even to this very day. And I just wonder how you see that. I mean, obviously the BBC is important here too. Do you feel that Channel 4 did justice to Iraq in dispelling the myth of the ignorance that clearly was out there? And obviously there's cultural things here. America, you know, and the American press did a very good job in disseminating ignorance. What do you think?
Well, I can only really speak for Channel 4, and I think that we worked very, very hard to try and contextualize what was going on. We had, for a start, we did something that the channel isn't necessarily that keen on doing. We had big studio debates, at least 4 or 5, I would say, in that period, in which we got all sorts of different views and experience aired. I think the Channel 4 News, I think we were perceived by the authorities as being, frankly, campaigning against the war. I mean, it was that bad. I mean, we were often accused of being. But it is extraordinary that, I mean, I think there was good reporting on all channels. I think it's an extraordinary thing that the drive for war was so great that it actually just bamboozled its way through everything, even through a demonstration that I am absolutely certain was 1 million strong.
Well, it became objective, didn't it? It almost became the objective, you know, the war's going to happen, this is the news, and therefore you were not allowed to question the ethics of the enterprise.
Yes, and I genuinely don't think we were hungry for war. I don't think any of us wanted to be involved in it in that sense. It wasn't a thrill or anything like that. It was a horrible thing to have to report. Horrible. I mean, I had been to Iraq many, many times before then. I was in the original Iran-Iraq war, and nobody with any brain would ever have wanted to see anything like that again. Ever to see, you know, mechanized war on the soil of Iraq again. It was a very, very difficult thing to deal with. You know, Yeah, I mean, we failed, yeah, but we tried.
Okay, one last question from here.
First of all, thanks very much for a really interesting evening. My question was, our appetite for breaking news and 24-hour news channels and rolling 20-minute news packages, certainly recently, do you think that that's hindering or nurturing the role that investigative journalism has to play?
I think it's exposing the need for it. And you see, one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic is that I actually think people will discover that the original, in the end, we were told the web was about content. And you can't generate content without organization. I mean, take, for example, a simple thing, the resignation of Gordon Brown 4 or 5 days after the general election. On that night, 7 o'clock, we went to air. We didn't even know he was going to resign. And at 80 minutes past, he did. Now, in that moment, helicopters were up. You could see the car moving from the moment it left Downing Street to the moment eventually it got to Buckingham Palace. All the players were out. All the theatre of democratic change was laid out before the electorate. Google's not going to do that. Google wouldn't put the helicopter up. That's not what they do. They need us. They need us for this enterprise, for this content. And just in the same way, Google is not going to investigate MPs as to whether they abided by their expenses in election fights. There is a case for us. I use I'm sorry if anyone's heard this allegory before, but I'm going to tell it to you again, and then you can shut me up. Who has seen the documentary Man on Wire?
Yes.
Man on Wire is a completely uplifting and remarkable document. Mad French tightrope walker decides in the depths of the French countryside, in some leafy farmy glade, that he wants to walk a tightrope between the Twin Towers, before, of course, they were brought down. He's never been to New York, he's never seen the Twin Towers, but he is a good tightrope walker. That's really all you can say. And he somehow, and the documentary uses people who were involved in this whole enterprise, one of whom is the most wonderful woman who clearly loved him to distraction, and that in itself is a very exciting factor. And anyway, somehow this lunatic gets to New York, somehow defies security, and eventually, with tremendous setbacks and difficulties, gets up the tower with his wire. He has still not even thought how he's going to get it across, but they get it across, and eventually he walks across. And he doesn't just walk across, he lies on it, he stands upside down on it, he pivots on it. And idiots, they didn't even take a movie camera with them to see him go across, so these are all stills. But you don't leave the documentary feeling you haven't seen him walk it. You don't feel you haven't seen the moving picture. But the point of the allegory is this. I see in one of those towers new technology, new media, the cyberspace providers, Google, Apple, Microsoft, whoever it is, Yahoo, they're all there in that tower. And we're in the second tower, and we are the content providers. We are cutting the mustard. We are the investigative journalists. We are the people who go to these places. We are the people who scramble the helicopters. We are the people they need, and we need them to transmit what we've got. Somehow, although none of us can walk a tightrope, and none of us even has a fucking tightrope, we will find a tightrope. And we will put it across. We will find a way of getting across. And we will walk across. And in the middle, we will meet them coming the other way. They need us as much as we need them. Okay, they're having a burst of money making now. But there's going to come a time quite soon when they're going to realize they need us much more than they know. And what we've got to ensure is that we've not so collapsed and disintegrated our capacity to do the job that we can't rise to this need of mankind will need. Personkind will need information about the world in which we live. You just cannot go on locked into your headphones listening to The Who or somebody more modern than that, or Blur or whatever it is. I can't get much more modern than that. But, or okay, Florence and the Machine. But you can't just do that, and you can't just bury yourself in your intimate emails or in the propaganda that comes across the web and the rest of it. We've got to have people like ourselves telling each other what's going on, and you can't just depend on Twitter to do that. We have a future. We're the best, the very best that ever happens. I look at ITV, for example, and people traduce ITV for having dumbed down. But in the woodwork, they still have some of the very, very best journalists anywhere in television. And they're rescuable. They're there to be deployed, to be flown, to be, And the same in the BBC. It's all out there to be grasped. And we will do it. But we've got to keep our nerve. We've got to keep it all together. We've got to go on producing more young talent, more people out in Mexico scrambling on their one camera, VJs and the rest of it, and we can make it. We will get the tightrope across. We'll start making money together. We'll make music together. We'll make the world a better place.
I would like to... Thank you, John. It's been a real privilege. Can I also thank David from the College of Journalism, Julie and the team from the Frontline Club.